Welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, everybody. What a wonderful, crazy week this has been. We are in the last week of July 2023, and there's so much going on that we're doing a special episode today. We finished season 2, but we couldn't help ourselves, and we're back already. It is Thursday. It's actually Thursday. Goodness, do you have it's the 27th. The 27th, and we are on the eve of what may be the Trump indictments, the third round of Trump indictments. So
maybe,
probably, possibly, potentially. So we didn't want to miss it, but we also didn't want to, if the indictments are coming down tomorrow, we didn't want to join that one with the other topics that are really important topics that we already have today and this week. So we're doing a Thursday session where we're going to talk about Israel. And you may ask, what does that have to do with the U.S. Legal Weekly News? But stay tuned to find out. We're going to talk about that and some constitutional review. And we are then going to go into, we might hit the Alabama case because that was recently in the news with the Supreme Court where they were told to go redraw the maps. And they have redrawn a map, but it may still be in violation of the Supreme Court's ruling. Anyway, okay, I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm with the Law Unscripted as well as Tehrani Law. And we have joining us our wonderful regular guest star, Dr. John R. Weil from Middle Tennessee State University. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Weil is an expert in the U.S. Constitution and the amending process, as well as constitutional law, the founding fathers, and a whole host of others, with basically meaning the foundations of our country. And it is such a pleasure to be able to talk with you all this summer, and especially today, about what those foundations are that we have, and then how do they mirror or reflect what's happening with the reforms in Israel, and what impact that they may have for us. So before we get to that, I'm going to do a quick wine. We always have our wine today, and I've been practicing because Dr. Weil will get mad at me if I don't pronounce this correctly. Because
we spent money on a French major for this one. So.
Yes, Dr. Weil, who's actually my father, did help invest in my college education. And surprisingly, it included a major in French, a double major. So it wasn't just French, but it has been over 2 decades since I've graduated with said French degree and have not spoken it since. So we're going to see how well I do. You can laugh at me or not, but today we have a Bordeaux, and it is a 2019 Chateau Rocher Calon Montagne Saint-Emilion. Now, don't ask me to say it fully in English, but that is what it is. I am going to put the label on our video for those of you who watch our YouTube video of it. For those of you listening, look in the descriptions for the actual spelling of this wine and how wonderful it is. Cheers to you guys on this happy hour on Thursday. And let's get into
it. You hear the bells ringing?
Oh, are your bells ringing on campus?
Yes. For those who don't know, as Dean of the Honors College, when our undergraduates write a thesis and defend it, we ring the bells for them. So there is a thesis defense going on next door, and apparently it was successful because we're ringing the bells.
Amazing. Well, we'll toast to that for sure. Well, wonderful. And thank you. Let me take a quick sip of the Bordeaux. Oh my gosh, that's lovely. That's really lovely. I wish of all of the wines that I could share this one with you. It's very smooth, very light, but also has that deep flavor of a good Bordeaux. I feel like I can actually taste just the grapes rather than the wine. So that's delightful. Look in the descriptions for a full description of it, the actual spelling of the name that I tried to pronounce. And let's get into Israel. Tell us what is happening with Israel and how this relates to us.
First, let's put something in quotations that you said before. Reform of the judiciary. Reform always depends on one's perspective. And for those who have been watching the scene in Israel, there have been literally tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in the streets over the past 3 or 4 months protesting an attempted change in the judicial system. And I guess I should describe what that is.
Yes.
So,
tell us what it is and what it is.
Yeah. Now let me start with a disclaimer. I am not an expert on Israeli politics.
Sure.
I'm planning to go to Israel and visit the Knesset this December, but I haven't been there yet. I have read descriptions, particularly the Supreme Court building, which is a beautiful structure there. But it's fascinating for an American and might even make us feel a little superior, although I would caution us not to get, let's see how the next election goes before we claim too much superiority. But, the United States, one of the differences between the United States and Great Britain, which we celebrate on Independence Day, is that the British do not have, and we got to qualify it, their constitution is not a single written document as our own is.
Right.
It consists of many documents, many precedents, many enactions by Parliament, but they're not all gathered together in a single spot. So, and for that reason, now, I believe this may have changed a bit as when Britain was in the European Union. I'm not sure about that. Whether one of the reasons they withdrew was the notion that they were having to abide by outside rules that they themselves didn't oppose. But traditionally in England, although they're known generally for their political stability, Parliament is legally sovereign in a way that our Congress is not. Our Congress can adopt a law, but it doesn't go into force unless the president signs it or it overturns its veto. And even when it's enforced, it can be overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court on the basis that it's unconstitutional.
It's subject to review.
Pardon? True, right, through judicial review. And of course, courts also, and here's where I'm a little unclear about the status of the new law. Our courts also exercise what's known as statutory interpretation, which basically means they decide what laws mean if the meaning is contested. So what's fascinating about Israel, if I'm understanding correctly, is they do not have, like Britain, they do not have a single written constitution. Now, they do have some things that are known as basic laws, which I take it to be that they weren't ratified in a special way like our Constitution was, but they're considered, even in the United States, we pay far more attention to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than we do of legislation involving some other matter. And there are a whole series of, Sherman Antitrust Act. You can think almost each decade has an important law like that.
Yeah, what we consider the bigger, broader laws.
Right.
Rather than, I hate to say the term, but smaller laws or less impactful laws for the continuing future.
In any event, Israel, although they've talked about it, as have the English, by the way, neither of them have a single written constitution or a specific Bill of Rights. But even though and by the way, they have we have a presidential system, they have a parliamentary system. In a presidential system, you have separation of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial. In a parliamentary system, you have a fusion of executive and legislative powers, because whereas our president can and sometimes is chosen independently of Congress, which is to say you can have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress or vice versa. In Israel, you have, in a parliamentary system, the prime minister is both, well, he's also head of, he's like ours, he's head of government and head of state.
Right.
But he's the leader of the leading coalition or party within parliament, which is in Israel is known as the Knesset.
It would be like Speaker of the House.
Pardon? He's sort of like a combination of a president and the Speaker of the House, I guess you could say. And unlike ours, so first difference is we have a written constitution and they don't. We have a presidential system, separation of powers, and they have a parliamentary system, which is a fusion of powers. And then if we go to a third distinction, their parliament is unicameral rather than bicameral. Now, which means one house versus two houses.
Whereas we have the House and the Senate, they have one parliament.
Have one parliamentary Knesset with 120 members. And the prime minister is the leader typically of the majority party. In this case, he's the leader of a majority coalition. And this coalition includes some very, very conservative, very right-wing. He's not in a position unlike that of Speaker McCarthy right now.
Okay.
Where he has, he is the leader of our House of Representatives, but he got there by making compromises, apparently, with all these different groups, which he has to continue to placate. Mm-hmm. But the fact, if our founding fathers were to look at this system, they would laud it for being democratic. It's one of the few democratic governments in that area of the world. And we have been allied with it largely for that reason, and also for the many Jews that we have in the United States who support it for that reason as well. But our founding fathers would say first, they did not accept the notion of parliamentary sovereignty. So whether my own view is that our founders intended for the judiciary to exercise judicial review. That comes from a fairly close attention to the documents that surrounded the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Not everyone has come to that conclusion, but we do know that prior to that time, there were states in which the judicial system would strike down a law as being contrary to the state constitution. Right. And I think most people anticipated that. It was fairly firmly established, at least by 1803, in a famous case written by Chief Justice Marshall, known as Marbury versus Madison. But my understanding is, so typically in a parliamentary system, you don't exercise judicial review. But apparently, the court in Israel has done something similar. Only we might say there might be some in the United States who would object to what the court is doing.
They're a little more proactive.
Well, I don't know if they've been more proactive, but they have had less textual basis for what they're doing.
Sure.
In other words, so let's go back again, the Constitutional Convention. Prior to setting up the judicial branch, there was a discussion, and it was highly favored, by the way, by James Madison, who's often called the father of the Constitution. He actually favored the establishment of what was known as a Council of Revision, whereby the president would be allied with leading members of the judiciary, and before a law went into effect, they would actually decide whether or not it was constitutional or not. And that was rejected. Well, let's back up. And maybe even beyond that, not only whether it was constitutional, but whether it was desirable, whether it was reasonable or whatever. Well, those powers, in a sense, got split. President exercises a qualified veto that can be overridden. The judiciary is given the power of judicial review, and it can be overridden in the United States either by the judiciary changing its mind or by the adoption of a constitutional amendment. But my understanding is what the Supreme Court in Israel has been doing is it has been judging laws on the basis of their reasonableness. And that standard is arguably, now it's not altogether different, perhaps from a court using the due process clause of the 5th or 14th Amendment saying, well, this law, while on its face is valid, violates, rights of criminal defendants or, whatever procedures would be. But when they exercise this power, they're not exercising it on the basis of a specific constitutional grant. They're doing it apparently by fairly well accepted construction over the last, it was founded in 48, so last 70 years or so, but they don't have the same textual basis as our Constitution does, so, or our courts do. So Netanyahu, who not incidentally is being accused of, and I wrote it down here somewhere, I'm probably not going to be able to find it now. In any event, he's right, fraud, bribery, and breach of trust.
And what is his official title?
Pardon?
Who is he in Israel? I know
Prime Minister.
Many of our viewers will know, but not everyone. He's
Prime Minister Netanyahu. Right. By the way, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel? Had ties to Milwaukee.
I have no idea.
Oh my! I think I took you to Milwaukee and pointed this out to you when we passed the library that was named after this person.
That was 25 years ago.
I know. The best years of your life.
Yes, they absolutely were, but I don't know details.
Okay, Golda Meir.
Oh, okay.
First Prime Minister of Israel. There's a library there in Milwaukee that's named after her because that's where she lived for a time.
Excellent. Okay, please continue.
In any event, okay, I think you got me off track here.
Yes.
The point was, so he wants to clip the power of the court to declare laws unreasonable. And he is making, the way he's phrased the argument is not inaccurate. He says it would be more democratic. He's right about that if you consider democracy to be the immediate will of the people as expressed in Parliament.
Gotcha.
And, there has been a fairly recent election in Israel that elected a group that then chose Netanyahu as their prime minister. So he's right. In the United States, of the three branches of government, the judicial branch is the least democratic. Now, I don't say that as a negative thing, but its members are appointed rather than elected.
Right.
Rather than serving fixed terms, they serve for basically, during good behavior, which is basically for life. And this was purposeful. When it came to do laws, abide by the Constitution, you don't want somebody, particularly someone who might be facing indictment, making that decision. You want it to be, now that brings its own problems, particularly when the Supreme Court, seems to manufacture constitutional rights and maybe then try to take them away again, that kind of thing. But I think the framers, if they were looking at this situation, and to the extent that the American government has expressed an opinion, it seems to be, somewhat cautious about the reforms that are being enacted. And the American framers would probably say, look, you already have a parliament that you're pretty much declaring to be sovereign. It's a unicameral branch, which typically means, good thing and bad thing, right? Yes. What if our government's always frozen because we got conflicts between the two branches and the president, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to speed things up, if you want immediate popular will to be done, courts get in the way of that.
Right.
On the other hand, they are designed to give this sober second look. So that's sort of what all the fuss is about. Do we believe if we just believe in parliamentary? And again, to my knowledge, now I think the situation has changed a little bit, but the House of Lords is the highest court of law in Great Britain, and at least through most of their history, that court has not exercised the power of judicial review. Now, what they will do sometimes is if they have a law that they can interpret in a fashion that they think is more consistent with values than what the language might actually say, they might do that.
Right.
And it sounds like, maybe the Israeli court has sort of perfected that technique. Well, this violates, due process. This is unreasonable, so we're going to strike it down. So, but, Netanyahu is right. If you want the immediate will of the Knesset and the prime minister to be enforced, then you don't want courts. But, our own history suggests that there are many times where even knowledge of this second look might deter a good bit of, congressmen can get up and say, well, I sort of like the sentiment behind this law, but I don't think it's going to pass muster under the Equal Protection Clause.
Right.
Or I believe it's, I'd like to execute rapists as much as the next guy, but I think that's probably cruel and unusual punishment. So
right.
probably
to say somebody else is going to look at this and might not like what I'm doing because we have this basis, this strong basis of the Constitution that is being fully interpreted through the Supreme Court.
Right. And I think what is particularly troubling, and again, I'm no expert in Israeli politics, but I think what's so troubling about the situation there is they seem to be split much as we are. The majority by which Netanyahu regained the prime ministership was very, very slender and depended not just on popular vote, but then on negotiating with these various factions there. And so what is scary is this is a situation, well, on the positive side, you always have, unless you get a vote of no confidence, Parliament can go ahead and enact whatever it is they think the people wanted. But on the downside, you might have a parliament that comes in tomorrow and reverses everything. It's sort of in the US, the equivalent is sort of the equivalent is probably that of executive orders, where presidents love to come into office. And what's the first thing they do, if it's a Republican comes into office following Biden, they're going to overturn a lot of his executive orders and put in their own. And it continues. And so the content, one of the traditional critiques of parliamentary government is that it tends to be spasmodic. It tends to go from sort of one extreme to the other. And, our parties, you could say, also have that same tendency, but the fact that they are divided into two houses and that they do have judicial review puts the brakes maybe on some of the more extreme enactments by either party when they do capture power.
Wow. And apologies in the background, as people who are familiar with our show know, we do have dogs, at least on my end of things. So there's been a little bit of a ruckus in the background. They're agreeing with your assessment.
Oh, very good.
There's a solid bark of approval.
Very good. Okay.
So where do you see this heading? And I know the qualifications, but do you have an anticipation of where this will end? And if so, what the impact will be?
Well, here's the fun part for me is the law has been adopted, basically clipping the power of the court. And so what happens next? The court examines the law.
Oh, Interesting.
So this is one of my favorite topics. One of my earliest writing things had to do with, I do a lot on the constitutional amending process. And one of the questions that bedevils scholarship in this area is the possibility that you could have an unconstitutional amendment. And could you have the court use the Constitution to strike down an addition to the Constitution? And I have always, first, I don't believe that I'm one of those on the side that there cannot be an unconstitutional amendment. You could have a tragic amendment that we would all deplore and wish could be repealed. But in my judgment, if it's in the Constitution, the court has to enforce it.
Okay.
But not everybody agrees with that. But look at this situation. I mean, so the Knesset is saying, we don't want you no longer have the power to exercise this power, and they hear a case. What if they do exercise the power? Now, this takes us to an example that you and I discussed earlier. We get something similar when the U.S. Supreme Court hands down a decision and those who are bound to enforce it say we're not going to do so.
We won't.
And there's this case, I don't know if you mentioned it here or not, but this recent case in Alabama where, just a month or two back, the Supreme Court basically surprised people because they had seemed to be retreating in the area, and they still have, I think, in the area of partisan gerrymandering.
Right.
But the court looked at the reapportionment in Alabama and said, you got a quarter of the population that's African American. You have only one of 8, I believe it was. Only one of
districts.
Pardon?
I think it's 7 districts.
Okay, well, whether it's 7 or 8, you only have one of all your districts that have predominantly African American. You had another plan there that had 2 such districts. You need to go with that.
Right.
And Alabama said, okay, we agree that our system wasn't perfect. Here's an alternate system, but it no longer has 2 majority African American districts. So you have a kind of defiance. You have something similar actually in Texas, apparently. Now, I don't think we've had a defiance yet of the court, but my understanding is that some of the recent measures that the Texas governor, presumably legislature, have taken with regarding to boundaries to the boundary seem to violate international law. And if they do, that is, that's if it's an agreement that the U.S. and 2/3 of the Senate have agreed to, then they're going to be, ultimately, if they don't give way, we're going to be in a situation, hopefully not nearly as serious, but a situation like we had in the Civil War, where this, one side, well, actually it was the northern side who was unwilling to accept the legitimate, to qualify. Lincoln said, I can't make Dred Scott free if the court says he isn't free, but just because the court has said something doesn't mean we all have to go along with it.
Right.
It's still up for grabs as to whether, we can exist as half free and half slave.
Right.
So it's, what's interesting is despite the differences in systems, there's some real parallels here.
Yeah.
And, traditionally, if for no other reason than prudence, if there were a new amendment that the court didn't like, I would say, I'm sorry. And you remember we've had an earlier discussion about the amending process that in Coleman versus Miller back in 1939, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that issues involving ratification of amendments were political questions. And I think it would be even more so when it came to the substance of an amendment, because one of the checks that's recognized on the judicial system is a check that we can overturn it. And so we mentioned the Dred Scott decision said African Americans are not and cannot be U.S. citizens. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens thereof.
Right. Right. Now that's absolutely fascinating. So Goodness. So what happens here? That's where we're just sitting.
We are. I mean, I guess the main thing is we have been such close allies with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Israel, we were the first nation to recognize the establishment of Israel. We've been involved, deeply involved in peace treaties there. We have proudly been able to say, even when their policies might have diverted from ours, but they're a democracy, they're doing it the right way, to the extent that, there's a worldwide phenomenon right now of, and it's sort of sad in my judgment, that, there have been times in history where democracy seems to be, the big wave.
Yeah.
And democratic republicanism, not just, and that's been overcome, I would say, by what's sometimes referred to as populism. But a populism that's allied often with authoritarianism, that, one person, whether it be, Erdogan in Turkey or Putin in Russia, or maybe Netanyahu in Israel, somehow sort of embodies, everyone, and you should give that person as much power as you can and let them go with it.
Right.
And, to the extent that happens, that is a departure from traditionally where we've certainly had strong presidents. But even our strongest presidents weren't able to get everything that they wanted.
Right.
And so it makes it, it makes the alliance more fragile. The more we have in common. You probably remember, Immanuel Kant had this notion.
Yeah, I at least remember him.
German philosopher, right?
Yes.
He had this theory, which has been partly borne out in history. It doesn't always work, but the theory was that democracies were less likely to go to war with one another. And that actually also this was combined with the notion of trade, that the more trade you had between countries, the more interconnected they were, the less, the higher the risk were of conflict. And so they'd be less likely to engage in it. And so,
well, isn't that kind of what we've been doing with Russia? Is the idea has been, because we're trade allies, that if we do these sanctions on trade, that will cause you to have these conflicts.
I think that's a little something different. There, we're trying to use trade as a kind of, something short of war to induce somebody. But the main argument is that the more democratic, hopefully the people are less willing to go to war than their rulers are. And you do see some of this right now in Russia, where, there seems to be a nascent, movement against the war in Ukraine, just basically because they don't think it's in Russia's best interest.
Sure.
So, it makes it harder, I think, for us to justify the kind of support we've been giving Israel. Again, partly depending on, what does the court do? Does the court actually, do they have some way of modifying this law that would stick, or, how permanent is the government? They've had a number of elections that, we've always consistently had one election every 4 years for president, in parliamentary, particularly in countries like Italy, Belgium. Well, is it Belgium or no, Netherlands right now? The government has recently fallen over the issue of immigration. And so that could change the dynamic a bit too.
Sure. Goodness. Okay. That's a lot going on. Thank you for explaining a lot more of it, so that me as well as many of our listeners and watchers can really understand a little bit better as to what's happening and why it's so monumentous and what it means with regard to their countries, well as what's happening with ours. And I think that goes into, like you were saying, we were talking about the Alabama redistricting is what happens there. It's who defies the Constitution, and they don't have the Constitution, like you've said.
Right.
It's more of a basis of a series and set of documents, but who defines, who has that final say?
Right.
Which power has that final say?
And you know, the traditional discussion, Federalist 78, was that Congress has the power of the purse, President has the power of the sword, power of enforcement. Right. Commander in chief, and then the power that maybe was underestimated, you know, all the court has is the power of judgment. But to the extent that people recognize basically that, you know, somebody has to be the final interpreter of the law, right, and we recognize that as going with the courts, then, you know, that's the kind of dilemma that Israel is facing right now.
Right. And as far as our own, what does happen with this new Alabama redistricting, where they redrew it? They went back, just like the Supreme Court said, and they redrew it, but there's still only one district instead of two. So what happens now with ours?
I don't know.
Okay. Wow.
I mean, my guess is there will be another suit challenging this. One of the tricky things about elections, and I'm not an expert in election law, but the closer you get to an election, the more reluctant courts are to intervene, because they really don't want to influence who's elected. You know, they want to make sure that the process is set up in a fair fashion. But the longer, you know, the closer it gets to the election, any solution they propose could sort of throw a monkey wrench into what's happening. So I don't know if the state will get by with this. You know, there have been some prominent cases, some death penalty cases in the past where the court has said you can't do it, and the state went ahead and executed somebody. So, you know, then what do you do? Right. You're sort of stuck with it.
What do you do? Okay, well, that will be very, very interesting. But Dr. Weil, thank you so much for joining us and for a lovely, lively conversation. Catch you guys next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.